Kris Kelso, you are an entrepreneur, a keynote speaker, and executive coach. You have worked with hundreds of entrepreneurs, business owners, and leadership teams to help them become better leaders. And today we're here to talk about your book, Overcoming the Impostor. Silence your inner critic and lead with confidence. Kris, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So there is no shortage of books on leadership, on entrepreneurship, and self-confidence. And first of all, I didn't know you. I was so delighted when I saw your book in the Amazon store, and I see that you have also a different perspective on how we can overcome this imposter syndrome that attacks all of us, entrepreneurs and business leaders and people who have any kind of goals in their life. Anybody who is shooting higher than where they are at this moment, they always face this voice: oh, I'm not good enough. Oh, there is so-and-so who is much better than me. Maybe I cannot do this. And well, I guess your book offers us a helping hand to overcoming this voice.
Yeah, absolutely. Imposter syndrome is something that I didn't know about until just a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, but I experienced it for a long period of my career. And when I learned about imposter syndrome and what it was like a light bulb went off, and I said, "Oh, that's that voice in my head, that inner critic that's always telling me that I don't know what I'm doing, or that I am at risk, or that eventually everyone's going to figure out that I'm just making this up as I go. I'm just figuring it out along the way, and I'm not actually the brilliant expert that they might think that I am." And it was such a relief to, first of all, just learn that imposter syndrome is a thing. And then as I began to study it and realize that as you mentioned, it's more prevalent among high achievers. The more ambitious you are, the more you're trying to take risks and push the boundaries and stretch yourself, the more likely you are to feel like a little bit of an imposter. And so I began to speak about this and talk with entrepreneurs that I was coaching and speak at conferences and events. And the response that I would get when I would talk about imposter syndrome and talk about my own story was just phenomenal. It was oh my goodness, what a relief to know that that's a thing, and that it's not just me, but it's something that we all experience.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about your own story? First of all, how do you get into entrepreneurship, into speaking, and what were the imposter syndrome scenarios that you had to face numerous times?
Yeah, so I was a software developer 20 years ago. So I've come from a technology background. And 14 years ago, I left my job and with a large healthcare company, and I started my own company that was an IT consulting firm. And early on, it was just me for a little while, and eventually I grew that company to millions in revenue and had a team of people. But I didn't have any formal business education. In fact, I never even went to college. I don't have a degree. And so everything I knew about business, I was just figuring it out along the way. I literally remember going to a large bookstore and buying a stack of books covering everything that I thought I needed to know about how to start and run a consulting firm. And I just started reading and studying. And when I got stuck or had trouble, I would ask somebody, and I would look to others who had done it before me. But as a result of that lack of education and just sort of figuring it out along the way, I always had this internal fear or worry that I really didn't know what I was doing and I wasn't qualified. And at some point, somebody was going to figure that out and say, "Oh, wait, you're not supposed to be an entrepreneur. You don't deserve to be here. You're just a poser." And so, I would always try to compensate and overcome those feelings of doubt. And like I said, eventually I had success. Everything around me said that I was successful, but I didn't feel it internally, and I wasn't accepting it and receiving it. And eventually I learned that that's a mind game that lots of people struggle with.
Right. It's funny. I didn't go to school until I was 30 years old, because when I was in my 1920s, I got into drugs, alcohol, and all this loser stuff.
Mm.
And I always had the imposter syndrome, like, oh, I don't have an education. So I went to school, I did my 4 years of university, and I said, well, the only thing I got from this education is this piece of paper. Really, it's not much to it. But having that piece of paper, although I don't think it contributed much to my knowledge, it gave me this self-confidence. I have the piece of paper. I
Yeah.
can prove that
Yeah.
I did this, and it's
Yeah.
just amazing. That's the magic of, I see it in many ways, of going to school. It's just to have a piece of paper that says I qualify. I know how to follow orders, or I know how to be part of a system.
Yeah. It shows that you completed something, right? It shows
Right.
that you put in the work and you passed a test and you achieved something. And there's lots of different ways to get that feeling of accomplishment. And here's the interesting thing that I've found is that what causes one person to feel like an imposter can be the exact opposite of what causes someone else to feel like an imposter.
Right.
So I struggled with a lack of education as a feeling of inferiority, but I've actually talked with people who said, I think I got by because of my degree, and I actually don't know what I'm doing. And my degree is what's got me in the door. My degree is what's got me the job. And then I felt like I was in over my head. And so what one person sees as their weakness, another person might see as their crutch or the thing that's sustaining them. And the psychological mind game of the imposter, which is, I refer to that voice in your head as the imposter that's trying to tell you that you're wrong. The psychological mind game is so tricky because it will figure out what your particular weakness is and will prey on that fear.
Right. I used to be the owner of a dance school, and it
Mm.
was funny to see executive doctors, people in high level positions who were leaders and admired, and all of a sudden break down with insecurities when they were facing a girl in front of them, and they didn't know what to do. So it
Yeah.
was very
Yeah.
funny. So imposter syndrome also depends on the circumstances of the person. So you could be full of confidence
Absolutely.
in this circumstance, but feel like a null in another circumstance.
Yes. One of the key principles that I outline in the book is that overcoming imposter syndrome is not a one-time event. It's not something that you learn about it and you put a few things into practice and then you beat it and you never have to deal with it again. In fact, if you're a person who's always growing and stretching and learning, like people like you and me, and I'm sure many of your listeners, then you're going to encounter imposter syndrome over and over and over. And you may completely have control of it in one area of your life where you feel very confident and very secure. But when you go to do something new, those feelings of, oh man, I really don't know what I'm doing, and I have no business being here, come flooding back. And one example of that for me is, this is my first book. And I felt many times unqualified to write this book about imposter syndrome during the process. And I felt like, well, what am I doing? I'm not an author. I'm an executive coach. I'm a leadership guy. I speak, but I've never written a book before. And so I had to actually use the tactics and the practices that I recommend in the book on myself to get through the process of writing the book and to put it out into the world and have the boldness and the courage to do that.
So would you say that we never really get rid of that imposter syndrome? We just know how to live with it and to take action in spite of our insecurities?
Yeah. Well, it's not even just live with it. It's learn to recognize the value of that voice. That voice that tells you that you're at risk is actually a signal of something great about to happen. So when you hear the imposter telling you, you don't deserve to be here, you're in over your head, that means there's learning opportunities.
Right.
That means you're surrounded by really smart and talented people who may intimidate you, but also have a lot to offer you that you can learn from. That means that you're about to accomplish something really, really powerful. Looking back at my career, I came to the realization that the moments when I was the most insecure, the most worried, the most scared, those were the moments that my career was about to change. Those were the most pivotal moments where if I did the right thing, doors would open and great things would happen and it would change the trajectory of my career. So I've learned to recognize that voice, that feeling of self-doubt as a sign of something great, and to lean into it rather than to back up when you want to retreat and recoil.
Yeah, and even it happens to the best of the best. I remember hearing this speech by Elon Musk saying, being surprised that his rocket worked, like he didn't
Yes.
expect himself to
Yes.
work. So in other words, we as I understood from you, we are always pushing that boundary and feeling like we are imposter, but we gotta uh, more forward anyways, and then once we succeed, then we get to have that confidence and feel like we are at ease with whatever. So for example, whenever you write your second book, you probably will feel more
Yeah.
confident, and you have less of this imposter syndrome that you have for this first one.
I hope so. An interesting quote that I found doing research was author Maya Angelou. After she had written 11 books, she actually said one time, every single time I put out a book, I think, oh, this is the one that is going to flop. This is the one that everybody's going to figure out that I really don't know what I'm doing, that I've just gotten lucky all these times.
Right.
So, there are times in our lives when that voice just keeps on creeping back. But again, you learn how to recognize it, how to combat it, and then how to leverage it as actually a sign of great things, and lean into those insecurities and do more than you would have done otherwise.
And how do we overcome the comparison trap? In my podcast, I continue comparing myself with Joe
Yeah.
Rogan every day, and I say, "Oh, I'm never gonna be as good as him." And of course, I don't know. I continue doing the thing that I'm supposed to do, which is another
Yeah.
podcast. But still, the nagging voice is over there. How do I overcome that? How can a listener overcome their comparison with someone who is superior in their game?
First, I think you have to recognize that there is no fair comparison that you can do, right? We never know somebody else's complete story. We know what we see on the outside. We know the success that they portray, but we don't know the trials that they've struggled with. We don't know the personal demons that they wrestle with. We don't know the compromises they may have made, the standards that they may have violated that we're not willing to violate to get where they are. And so comparing yourself to another person is always a trap, because you're comparing the reality of your own life with a very polished and filtered version of someone else's life. And that's not to deride anyone else's success or try to bring people down to make yourself feel better. It's just to recognize that you can't do a comparison. You can't do a fair comparison, because you know all the junk in your life, but you don't know all the junk in their life. You only see the good of someone else, or you only see what they want you to see, what they want to portray. So in the book, I outline a couple of principles about measuring success against yourself rather than against other people. Right? If you're making progress towards your goals, then you are successful. And it doesn't matter what kind of progress someone else is making against their goals, because they have a different set of goals, different values, different principles that they live by. And it's just not a fair comparison to try to always track yourself against another person.
Wow.
So it starts with just recognizing that comparison just doesn't work. You just can't do it. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a lot to learn from Joe Rogan or another successful person. You take the principles you can from them, you see and aspire and learn and develop yourself. But falling into that comparison trap of I'm only good enough if I can match Joe Rogan or someone else, that's a fallacy, and you'll never win that battle.
Wow. Okay. I would like to hear a few more of those principles, but I like to share a technique that I use in order to overcome my imposter syndrome, is that I look back to where I was a year ago, And then I see, wow, like today I still feel like I cannot compete with Joe Rogan, but look where I'm coming from. A year ago, I
Yeah,
only have 5 listeners in my podcast. Now I have 10. And so there is a 100% increase. And,
yeah,
or how many, whatever blog posts. So to see that improvement, as you say, comparison with ourselves, that help us overcome that imposter syndrome. So
absolutely.
can you share with us on a few more of the principles that you have in order to overcome the imposter syndrome?
Yeah, one of the things I learned and that you just sort of touched on is I worked with an executive coach years ago who taught me about the difference between self-esteem and self-efficacy. And the difference is self-esteem is largely emotional. It's a feeling about yourself, and self-efficacy is a fact-based assessment of where you are. And so one of the principles that he taught me was, particularly when I was trying something new and I didn't feel like I was qualified, or I was really worried that I would fail. He said, Kris, you can't look at whether or not you've done this thing before. You have to look back at your track record of success in things you've never done before. So the fact that I can accomplish something like write a book and publish it, even though I have no experience doing that, I don't believe that because I'm an expert writer and publisher. I believe it because throughout my life, I've tackled things for the first time and been successful. And looking back at my ability to learn and adapt and adjust in real time and figure something out, that's what gave me the confidence to write a book and publish a book and do these things that are new for me. So self-efficacy is a honest, fact-based look at what is my history, what does my track record tell me about what I can and can't do, and then give me the confidence to try something new because I've tried something new many times before and it's never killed me.
Wow. Let me ask you, are there any similarities between being a perfectionist and having imposter syndrome? I have a friend who I consider to be so good at many things this person does, but this person is such a perfectionist that she's always afraid to ship out. So I don't know if
Yeah.
it's a perfectionist mindset or the imposter syndrome that I'm just not good enough as or
Yeah.
good enough as the others.
So I have struggled with perfectionism much of my life, and I tell some stories about that in the book. But one of the things that I learned in studying is psychologists, uh, they define perfectionism two different ways, right? There's normal or healthy perfectionism where you set very high standards and you want to achieve those, but when you fall short, you're still able to take some pride in what you accomplished. And then there is what they call neurotic perfectionism, which is people who set unreasonably high standards for themselves, and then they take absolutely no pleasure in anything they do that is short of that standard. And the neurotic perfectionism is what is dangerous and unhealthy. It's what creates a lot of stress and anxiety. And there's a correlation between people who have neurotic perfectionist tendencies and struggling with imposter syndrome, because it makes sense because they set high standards and they never ever can meet those standards. So they always feel like a fraud or a failure. But the problem is, A, setting those standards far too high, and then B, never allowing yourself to feel self satisfaction, gratification, to actually enjoy getting 80% to your goal. I tell one story about when I set a bar to hit $1 million in revenue in my first business. We had done about $300,000 the year before, and I wanted to hit $1 million. And this was a boutique consulting firm, not a high growth tech company. So that kind of growth is pretty aggressive for a professional services based company. But I said, we're going to hit $1 million next year. And I had some people say, wow, that's pretty aggressive. Well, we didn't hit $1 million. We did around 580,000. You know, we almost doubled our revenue from the previous year, but we didn't hit that goal. We did hit $1 million the following year. So that was a 60% growth followed by a 70% growth year. Well, I could have beat myself up over not hitting that in 1 year. and that would be neurotic perfectionism. But I didn't. I allowed myself to look back and say, wow, I set a really high bar. I didn't quite hit it, but man, look what we did. And I was able to take some gratification in that success and get there in 2 years instead of 1 and still feel really good about it. And that's healthy perfectionism, high standards, but accept the wins even when you miss the mark a little bit.
Wow. Kris, one more thing about your own career. What made you make the transition between the consulting that you do to becoming an executive coach and a keynote speaker?
Yeah, so my first business was an IT consulting firm, leveraging my technology background. But really quickly, I learned that most technology problems are people problems. And so we would go into these companies that had dysfunctional, underperforming IT departments. And when we started to assess what's going on, what's really happened, we found it was leadership issues, it was communication problems, it was process, certainly, but it was largely around the people, not the tech. The technology is not usually the actual issue. And so over time, though we were an IT consulting firm, we were doing people work. We were putting new leadership in. We were figuring out, assessing talent. We were restructuring and organizing. We were teaching and training on communication and planning. And so as I started to see where that was the struggle, I began to work and move further up the ladder in organizations, from working just with IT to working with the C-suite and the leadership of the company. Because a lot of times those communication and leadership issues trickled down from the very top. And so I remember a time when we were still very IT focused, but I said, one day I want to work with owners, board of directors, and the C-suite. I want to work with the people who pull the levers, who really set the tone, who create the culture, because all of this IT work we do doesn't last if there's not a healthy company culture at the top. And so then it was a series of moves and learning and growth and training and development, intentionally focused on getting to the place where I am now, where all of my clients today are the owner operator of their business, with a few minor exceptions here and there. But I always work with the owner of a business or their C-suite, their leadership team. And that's where I can affect the most change. So to summarize that, it was really about, trying to do good work, realizing we were limited by what was happening above us, and saying, well, I've got to do my work at the very top to have the kind of impact that I want to have.
Wow, amazing. So, okay, Kris, can you tell us one more time the title of your book and where people can find it?
Yeah, it's called Overcoming the Imposter. And it can be found anywhere, that any major retailer where books are sold, or the easiest way to find it is go to overcomingtheimposter.com.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. I enjoyed it.